Moving on, though, I do want to actually focus on Yevgeny Prigozhin. Without taking too much of a deep dive into his background, because there is a lot, I think the main things to know are that he's a Russian oligarch, former criminal, has his tentacles or arms, whatever you want to say, in a lot of different sectors and a lot of different, like, kind of dangerous quasi government sectors. He's also a close confidant of Vladimir Putin, but at the same time, I've heard that he's not ever been like directly in the same circles as Vladimir Putin, but he's always been someone that him and Putin have had kind of a business slash quasi strategic relationship where they both have kind of benefited off of each other's power. But things are changing, which we'll get into that in a moment. But the interesting part of of Prigozhin's background is that he's called Putin's chef because he owns restaurants and catering companies that provide services for the Kremlin. And the interesting thing, too, about him is that he, like I said, he has his hands in a lot of corrupt and violent institutions. But the interesting thing is that if you asked him 2 years ago if he created the Wagner Group or if he was involved in Russian disinformation in the United States, he would have said no. But since the invasion, he's just pretty much admitted to all the shit he's doing, and there's a lot. So, for example, he long denied his role in Russian interference in the 2016 elections and the 2020 elections. However, in November of last year, he admitted it and said he would continue doing this, basically. Also, the interesting thing is that he actually has admitted that he was the founder and longtime manager of the Internet Research Agency. If that name sounds familiar to you, that's because this is the notorious Russian agency that was accused of putting up these troll farms and other propagandist operations to basically sow discord in the United States around our elections, politics, media. It was basically that fire hose of falsehood, right? Flooding the system with so much shit that no one knows what to believe anymore. And the IRA, or the Internet Research Agency, was key in this. And Prigozhin was a key player in this industry. And you hear so many reports about what this agency did, and they still are active from what I've understand. But anyways, he also denied for a long time being the founder of the Wagner Group. But now he just admits it. An article I was reading writes here in quotes, after years of denying his links to Wagner, he eventually confirmed that he was its founder in September of 2022. He stated that he founded it in May 2014 to support Russian forces in the war in the Donbass. And now the interesting thing to me here is, and it's just my theory, is that why do you think all of a sudden he wants people to know that he is involved with this stuff? Because look, he has denied founding the Wagner Group. He has denied forming the Internet Research Agency. He's denied all of these quasi-shadow government affairs that he's been involved in. And part of me thinks the reason why all of a sudden he is letting the public and other nations be aware of what he's up to is because he has political aspirations. He wants people to know that he is running the shadow military in Ukraine. He wants people to know that he's been involved in election interference in the United States. And I think it's a message to the Russian elite and to some in the Kremlin that he is a high-profile figure, and he wants us to know that he is, kicking ass and taking names. Because there's a lot of big changes where he seems more emboldened to admit all of his wrongdoing. And that is somewhat troubling to me, and we'll get into why in a minute, but he's in this beef with Putin, his popularity's growing, and he's at a war of words with the defense ministry. That tells me that he's up to something. And anyways, the Wagner Group, too, I encourage you guys to listen to the podcast I did, probably about a year ago. But the Wagner Group, has kind of fascist, neo-Nazi-esque views and values. They've butchered a lot of innocent civilians. Not a good group by any means. And they basically just committed atrocities throughout Libya, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. So before we get into this beef with Putin, though, and why there are thoughts that he may try to take power, I should also note that Prigozhin has been heavily involved in Africa and the Wagner Group as well. And there's a lot of influence there. I mean, maybe some of the propaganda he's spouting there is why we keep seeing a lot of African countries stay quiet about what's happening in Ukraine. Some worry, though, that he is practically exporting politics and propaganda in a box to Africa. Politics in a box. And I read an article in NPR that was this transcript of an interview between NPR and its correspondent, Charles Maines, who works out of St. Petersburg, And basically in the interview, he discusses how he went to this new building called the Wagner Center in St. Petersburg, where it looks like they are trying to create some sort of business empire, growing media conglomerate, something like that. He says in the interview, in quotes, "In a gritty industrial district of St. Petersburg, a new glass office tower rises. The words Wagner Center emblazoned across its rooftop. It's a symbol of Wagner's growing business empire, and it turns out you can get a tour." And he just looks into how the company is not just a military group anymore. It's like a complete like shadow quasi parallel government apparatus or something. Anyways, it should be made clear as well that while the Wagner Group, is influential in a lot of ways and has been a necessary piece of this war of aggression in Ukraine, the group does need to keep succeeding in Ukraine if it wants to remain popular. And if it does, but if it does seem like Prigozhin can exploit the failures of the defense ministry and fill some sort of void. What I want to talk about here, though, is how there are reports and theories about how Putin and Prigozhin are no longer friends, and that there could be forces in the background that want Prigozhin to lead Russia. Now, there's a guy, Jason J. Smart, and I want to go into his background just to add context so you guys know he's not just some, theorist or speculator or whatever. He's a smart guy. I guess you could say smart is smart. And he has a PhD. He's also a political advisor, foreign policy expert. He's lived and worked in Ukraine, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Russia, throughout Latin America. I saw he speaks like Russian, Ukrainian, Spanish, English, something else maybe. So not a dumb guy by any means. And according to the Kiev Post, which he writes for, due to his work with the opposition to Vladimir Putin, Smart was a persona non grata for life by Russia in 2020. And despite his collaboration with the Russian opposition, he continues to this day. And he worked in U.S. politics. He was also on the presidential campaign of Senator John McCain. He founded an NGO for Free Ukraine in 2015. And he was the former director of the Security Service for Ukraine. So not an idiot by any means. And the reason why I'm starting with this is because he has an interesting article in the Kiev Post, and he does an interview with Newsweek, and he notes in quotes here, "People have speculated that given the frayed relationship with Putin, Prigozhin may recognize the changing winds in Russia as being his own window of opportunity to move up the ladder to the top spot." And the article goes into how he's been in a beef with people like Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu for years. And it talks about how his anger was stoked when the Kremlin took credit for some Russian victory in Soledar, which apparently the Wagner forces were heavily involved in. Smart has also told Newsweek that it seems like Prigozhin is being seen more and more as a power center in Russia. He notes here in quotes, "History shows that sometimes leaders fall not because they've done something wrong in the eyes of their citizens, but simply because a young lion wishes to usurp the old lion king." And Smart argues that Prigozhin could be that lion. And I read through the Kiev Post article and the interview in Newsweek, and there are some interesting insights into this theory. But of course, there's a myriad of challenges that Prigozhin could face if he actually wanted to replace Putin, which kind of sounds insane given, how paranoid and delusional Putin's become. But that being said, first off here, hold on, let me write that down. 6-4. The first one here is that Putin has quite an authoritarian state, right? He's created an entire apparatus around him that's kept him in power for quite a while. And it's going to be difficult to just overthrow someone, right? But in this Kiev Post article, Smart writes in quotes here, "In a situation where Prigozhin would seek to topple his benefactor, he would likely need to execute several other steps in rapid succession." And you guys probably know what that means, right? It means eliminating others who might want the power, others that might want to fill the power vacuum, all that type of stuff. And likely candidates for this would be Shoigu, as I talked about earlier, or the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. And Ramzan Kadyrov is quite a character, atrocious guy in my opinion. He has also criticized Putin's unwillingness to go further right now in the war in Ukraine. So he's another hardliner. And I actually think too, if some of these others were replaced or taken out or whatever, I think a lot of the others in the Kremlin would go along too. Like, of course, I can't read the minds of people inside the Kremlin, but it seems like the far right has a lot of influence in Russia and that Putin is under a lot of pressure to do more. I can't help but wonder what would happen if Putin were to be deposed. I'm sure not everyone would be crying about it. And I guess if the Russian military keeps struggling, the Wagner Group wins the propaganda game, it'd be a lot easier. Now, if we keep playing this scenario that Smart discusses out in our heads, Prigozhin would also need legitimacy, since he would be in power without elections, and he'd be violating the Constitution, which I'm surprised they still even care about that based on some of the things I've been seeing. I definitely am not a Russian constitutional expert, but it would be unconstitutional for Prigozhin to just assume power, right? Because technically, like, Russia's sort of one of those hybrid autocratic states where there are elections, technically. Again, the next part of those Smart's article, so talking about legitimacy, it's kind of troubling on how he thinks Prigozhin could get legitimacy. He writes one strategic route that Prigozhin could take, and it would be trying to secure power and secure backing from the West itself. Almost have the West make some sort of agreement with you. And Smart writes about how while the United States has said it's not backing regime change, Prigozhin could gain the White House's support by basically taking possession of Russia's nuclear arsenal, which would be terrifying, by the way. Smart writes here in quotes, having the nation's nukes in hand would allow Prigozhin to both fend off any entrenched elements in the Russian military, forcing those who had not yet taken sides to come on board, while at the same time giving him a chip with which he could negotiate with the West. And of course, this is all speculation, but it kind of makes sense if Prigozhin does want power. He would need some deal with some outside force, right? And I don't know what China's standing there would be, but you have to imagine that China would probably still kind of back Vladimir Putin. And he talks about how the West may go as far as demanding, for example, a total Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. And Smart actually says Prigozhin may actually agree to this as long as it means achieving his goal of running Russia, right? Like, okay, you lose Ukraine, but now you're the leader of Russia and Putin is out. I think that would be interesting. Now, that's the part I don't particularly agree with, just because we know how hardline some of these people have been. But at the same time, if you want power, sometimes you're willing to do that. And then Smart writes here, having disposed of Putin, the new leader would need to move quickly to prevent someone from pushing him from power. And so Western support would be the key. Now, I think this would put the United States and our allies in kind of a pretty difficult dilemma here, because this would pretty much mean Russia's future, Russia's leadership, Russian people would be under a dangerous and atrocious human being. Also, would Zelensky accept this? Like, this is all kind of a thought experiment at this point. But I do think it's interesting that Smart wraps up the interview with Newsweek. He says, in quotes, I think the most likely thing, above 95% certainty, the most likely way this war ends is that Putin is replaced, or that he dies, is killed, or is gone. And I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. Again, this guy is smart, but of course you can never really predict the wheels of war once it's going. But the fact that this guy actually thinks that there's a certainty or a likelihood that Putin is replaced, what I will tell you guys, it would not be from someone on the left. It would be someone further right, like a Prigozhin. So, if this isn't fascinating enough, the Carnegie Endowment for Democracy actually has a pretty interesting article that also expresses some thoughts on this potential change in leadership. The article is interesting because it actually doesn't think it's as likely as Smart does, but it also does provide us with some more theoretical insight into how this could happen and why Prigozhin has a ability to do it, if anyone is. And apparently, like, the article gives us a background of Prigozhin a little bit, and prior to the invasion of Crimea, Prigozhin was never really close enough to Putin, and he wasn't close enough to Putin's inner circle. Sorry, let me repeat that. But prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Prigozhin was never close enough to Putin. Like, he knew Putin, Putin knew him, but he wasn't really influential or in that inner circle. However, he found a way to operate in the shadows and kind of, like I said, create this parallel government apparatus that was successful but without any accountability, I guess you could say. And the article writes in quotes here, the conflicts in both the Donbass and then Syria, plus Russia's standoff with the West, meant that a market emerged for gray geopolitical tactics that unwieldy official institutions would struggle to deliver, right? Like, it's hard for the Russian government to respond to some of these quasi-conflicts. But what if you have a group like the Wagner Group or the Internet Research Agency be able to provide these services at a price, and then Putin's government isn't held accountable for it? And Prigozhin started using informal tools of influence, right? Media mechanisms such as troll factories, mercenaries throughout Libya, Syria, and now Ukraine. And like the Carnegie Endowment for Democracy says, this enabled his organizations to operate out of sight and without being held accountable. And basically, Putin has been able to outsource government programs and services, and it's kind of benefited both of them. And the article writes later in quotes, Prigozhin had hit the mother lode. If the state was unable to effectively solve certain tasks, or simply did not want to be seen doing some, these quasi-state tools could fill the gap. Putin liked this approach, which is also in demand in the war against Ukraine. And so that gets us to this point where the two have a relationship out of necessity. But I think what's changing here is that Prigozhin's tactics, like recruiting criminals and convicts to fight for the Wagner Group, and the war being lost, and the lack of resources and sanctions and everything, has kind of put strains on their relationship. And as Prigozhin and others, like Chechnya's leader, have kind of put more pressure on Putin, the relationship is different. The thing here, though, is that this Carnegie Endowment for Democracy article is skeptical of Prigozhin's ability to actually be the leader of Russia or get rid of Putin or anything like that. The article notes that he still has informal ties. For example, he still is really not in Putin's inner circle, and he has a lot of questionable ties with different groups that may come back to backfire on him. Also, his popularity back home is not as large as some have argued. I think he's more known amongst elite circles and on the far right, but he's not just like the most known guy. He's not like an Alexei Navalny or something. And apparently in polls that examine people's trust in politicians, he's barely mentioned. There's a Levada Center survey that was done at the end of 2022, and apparently just 3 people out of 1,600 that were polled actually knew him or named him. I think that could be true, but if the Russian state keeps failing to deliver on promises abroad and internally, it allows Prigozhin to maintain legitimacy and maybe seek that window of opportunity to do something. Also, he is very good at propaganda, and he has a lot of allies on the right. And I'll end this with this, is that the Carnegie Endowment has an interesting quote, and I think this kind of sums things up well. It says, "War makes monsters out of men, and their recklessness and desperation can become a challenger to the state if it shows even the slightest sign of weakness." It'll be interesting to see, but I think we will see some political infighting grow, especially if Russia keeps struggling and the war continues. And the last thing I'll just say is I think that's why, even with all the lies and the GOP criticisms of continuing to fund the war, I think that's why this war is so important to keep helping Ukraine, because we want there to be internal issues in Russia. We want Putin gone. I don't know if we want Prigozhin, but we do want change, and we need to keep sticking with Ukraine. So anyways, not the happiest of topics, but I hope your Monday goes well. I hope it's warmer wherever you are. If I have any listeners in a warm, beachy type of place, let me know. But anyways, you can find me on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, I don't know, whatever else there is out there. Have a great rest of your day. Adios.